"You're not even half the woman my mother is," my daughter-in-law said. I pushed my chair back and... Some words cut deeper than any blade. Some moments change everything. This was both. The crystal chandelier above our dining table had witnessed 40 years of family dinners, but it had never seen anything like this. The Waterford glasses my late husband Marcus had given me for our 20th anniversary sat half empty, the wine inside them trembling from the force of my daughter-in-law's words. "You're not even half the woman my mother is." The sentence hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid, suffocating, impossible to ignore. I pushed my chair back and stood slowly, my silk Armani dress rustling against the Italian leather seat. At 60, I'd learned that the most powerful responses often came wrapped in silence. But let me tell you how we got here. Because this wasn't just about a family dinner gone wrong. This was about 40 years of building an empire, 30 years of raising ungrateful children, and one moment that would either destroy everything I'd worked for or finally set me free. Chapter 1. The foundation. My name is Victoria Sterling, though I wasn't born with that last name. I was born Victoria Washington in a 2-bedroom apartment in Southeast D.C., where the sound of sirens served as our nightly lullaby, and dreams felt like luxuries we couldn't afford. The apartment building where I spent my first 18 years no longer exists. I bought it in 1995 and had it torn down to build a community center. Some might call that vindictive. I call it full circle. You see, when people look at me now, sitting in my penthouse office overlooking the Potomac or hosting charity galas that raise millions for underprivileged youth, they assume I've always lived in this world of privilege. They see the Louboutin heels, the perfectly coiffed hair, the way I can silence a boardroom with just a raised eyebrow, and they think this came naturally. They're wrong. Every designer dress I own was bought with money I earned through 18-hour days and sleepless nights. Every piece of art in my Georgetown mansion was purchased with profits from deals that men in $1,000 suits said I'd never close. Every diamond in my jewelry collection represents a barrier I broke, a ceiling I shattered, a person who underestimated me and lived to regret it. But success, I've learned, is the loneliest achievement of all. Especially when the people who should celebrate it with you, your own family, treat it like a personal affront to their existence. Marcus understood. God rest his soul, my husband understood what it took to build something from nothing. We met in 1982 when I was 25 and he was 28. I was working at a small real estate firm, selling properties in neighborhoods that white agents wouldn't touch. He was a contractor, building custom homes for clients who barely saw him as human. "Victoria," he said to me on our third date, his calloused hands gentle against my cheek, "you've got thunder in your eyes and lightning in your soul. Don't let anyone dim that storm." He never did. For 28 years, Marcus Sterling was my partner in every sense of the word. When I wanted to start my own real estate firm, he mortgaged his truck to give me seed money. When I decided to expand into commercial development, he worked overtime to fund my dreams. When I told him I wanted to build an empire that would change how Black women were seen in business, he handed me his tools and said, "Let's build it together." We did. Sterling and Associates became Sterling Properties, which became Sterling Development Group, which became Sterling Enterprises, a billion-dollar conglomerate with interests in real estate, construction, hospitality, and technology. We employed over 3,000 people across 12 states. We'd built something that would last generations, or so I thought. Chapter 2. The Cracks in Paradise. Marcus died 3 years ago. Sudden heart attack at 57, gone before the paramedics could even get him to the hospital. One moment he was reviewing blueprints for our latest housing development. The next, he was collapsing in his office, calling my name. I held his hand as the life left his eyes. I whispered promises about continuing our work, about making him proud, about keeping our family together. The funeral was attended by senators and CEOs, by families whose children had scholarships because of our foundation, by communities whose lives we'd changed through affordable housing and small business loans. But at the end of the day, when all the mourners went home and all the flowers wilted, I was alone in a house too big for one person, with children who seemed more interested in their inheritance than their grief. My son David was 32 when his father died. He'd worked for Sterling Enterprises for 5 years, starting in a junior position despite his MBA from Wharton. Marcus and I both believed in earning your place, even if you were born into privilege. David never quite grasped that concept. "Why do I have to start at the bottom when everyone knows I'm your son?" he'd complain during our weekly family dinners. "Other companies would make me a VP right away. Other companies didn't build their reputation on merit," I'd respond. "When you run Sterling Enterprises someday, people need to respect your expertise, not just your last name." That someday became a source of increasing tension after Marcus's death. David seemed to think that grief would make me sentimental, that I'd hand over the keys to an empire because he shared my DNA. He was wrong about that too. But David wasn't my only disappointment. My daughter, Sarah, 29 and fresh out of law school, had different plans entirely. While David wanted to inherit the business, Sarah wanted to dismantle it. "Your generation built wealth by exploiting communities," she announced at Thanksgiving dinner last year, her natural hair styled in the kind of elaborate crown that took 3 hours and cost more than some people's rent. "I want to use my privilege to give back, to tear down the systems that created this inequality." The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter wanted to destroy the very empire that paid for her education, her apartment, her organic food delivery, and her ability to work at a nonprofit that barely paid her salary. She wanted to be a revolutionary funded by the establishment she claimed to despise. "Sarah," I said, cutting into my turkey with more force than necessary, "you can't tear down what you've never helped build, and you can't give away what you've never earned." "That's exactly the kind of capitalist thinking that's destroying our communities," she shot back. Marcus, had he been alive, would have mediated. He had a way of making our children see reason without making them feel diminished. But Marcus wasn't there, and I was tired of playing peacekeeper between my ungrateful offspring and their conscience crises. But the real source of my current misery walked into our family 2 years ago on David's arm, wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and speaking in the kind of honeyed southern accent that made every statement sound like a compliment and an insult simultaneously. Jessica Claire Pemberton Sterling. Even her hyphenated name was an assault on everything I'd built. Chapter 3. The Interloper. Jessica was everything I wasn't, and she made sure everyone knew it. Where I was direct, she was passive-aggressive. Where I was ambitious, she was traditional. Where I had built my worth through decades of hard work, she had inherited her sense of superiority along with her trust fund and her grandmother's pearls. She was 26 when she married my 32-year-old son, a petite blonde with blue eyes and the kind of refined mannerisms that come from private schools and cotillion classes. Her family owned plantations in Georgia, actual plantations that they'd converted into event venues, and spoke about with the kind of nostalgic reverence that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Victoria," she said during our first meeting, her voice dripping with what she probably thought was warmth, "David has told me so much about your little business empire. How wonderful that you've been able to achieve so much despite, well, you know." Despite what? Despite being black? Despite being a woman? Despite being born poor? She never finished that sentence, but she didn't have to. The implication hung between us like a Confederate flag. From the beginning, Jessica made it clear that she saw herself as David's salvation rather than his partner. She had refined tastes that his old life couldn't accommodate. She needed a different kind of house, something with proper pedigree in the right neighborhood. She needed David to work in a more respectable industry, something that didn't involve urban development or community outreach. She needed him to distance himself from me. "David, darling," I overheard her say during a family barbecue 6 months after their wedding, "don't you think it's time you struck out on your own? Maybe started your own firm? You're so talented, and you shouldn't have to live in your mother's shadow forever." My shadow. As if 30 years of building generational wealth was something shameful that needed to be escaped rather than something precious that should be protected and expanded. But David, God help him, was smitten. He'd always been susceptible to feminine manipulation, a weakness that Marcus and I had hoped he'd outgrow. Instead, he seemed to get worse with age, especially when the manipulation came wrapped in blonde hair and southern charm. Within a year of their marriage, David had moved to the strategy division of Sterling Enterprises, a made-up position that kept him away from the day-to-day operations while still technically keeping him on the payroll. Jessica had insisted they buy a house in McLean, Virginia, 45 minutes away from the family home in Georgetown, where Sunday dinners had been a tradition for over 2 decades. "It's just so much more convenient for David's new responsibilities," Jessica explained when I questioned the distance, "and the schools are better for when we start our family." Our family. As if she was joining something rather than slowly dismantling it. Chapter 4. The Quiet War. What followed was 2 years of the most sophisticated psychological warfare I'd ever encountered. Jessica never said anything openly disrespectful. She never made direct attacks or issued ultimatums. Instead, she waged her campaign through 1,000 small cuts, each one designed to weaken my relationship with my son while positioning herself as the reasonable party. Sunday dinners became irregular. "David's just so tired from his new responsibilities," Jessica would explain in her text messages. "Maybe we could do every other week instead." Family vacations were suddenly inconvenient. "The timing just doesn't work with our commitments, but y'all have fun." Business discussions were redirected. "Oh, Victoria, let's not talk shop at dinner. David works so hard during the week." And gradually, almost imperceptibly, David began to change. The son who used to call me every morning to discuss the day's agenda started communicating through emails. The boy who used to seek my advice on everything from investments to relationships started making decisions without consulting me. The man who used to defend our family's work with passion began speaking about it as if it were a burden he'd inherited, rather than a legacy he was meant to continue. "Mom, maybe it's time we started thinking about succession planning," he said during one of our increasingly rare private conversations. "I mean, you're not getting any younger and the business is getting more complex. Maybe we should bring in some outside consultants to help streamline operations." Outside consultants. Translation: white executives who would slowly push me out of my own company while David played figurehead. "David," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "this business survived the 2008 recession, the 2020 pandemic, and every other crisis of the past 40 years because we kept decision-making in the family. Why would we change that now?" "Because times are different, Mom. Markets are more global. Investors expect certain standards." Standards. Another one of those loaded words that Jessica had taught him to use. Standards meant more than just business practices. Standards meant respectability in the eyes of people who would never see us as their equals, no matter how successful we became. But Jessica's masterstroke wasn't in changing David's business philosophy. It was in changing his identity as a black man. "We've decided to join Countryside Club," David announced during one Sunday dinner that Jessica had actually attended. "Jessica's family has been members for generations, and they've agreed to sponsor us." Countryside Club. I knew it well, an old money institution that had only started accepting black members in the past decade, and only then because of legal pressure. The kind of place where diversity meant having one black family and one Jewish family at the annual gala. "Since when are you interested in golf?" Sarah asked, clearly as surprised as I was. "Since I realized that business relationships require social connections," David replied, not meeting my eyes. Sometimes you have to go where the power is. Where the power is, not where you can build power, not where you can change who has power, where you can beg for scraps from the master's table while pretending you belong there. Marcus would have been heartbroken. Chapter 5. The Last Straw. The breaking point came 3 months ago, during what should have been a celebration. Sterling Enterprises had just closed the largest deal in our company's history. A $200 million mixed-use development that would bring affordable housing, retail space, and a community health center to an underserved neighborhood in Baltimore. It was exactly the kind of project Marcus and I had dreamed about when we started the company. Profitable enough to sustain the business, impactful enough to change lives, and large enough to cement our legacy as developers who cared about more than just bottom lines. The Baltimore City Council had chosen us over 3 other firms, including 2 that had submitted lower bids. They chose us because of our track record, our community relationships, and our commitment to hiring local workers and contractors. It was the kind of victory that validated everything we'd worked for. I planned a celebration dinner at the house. Nothing too elaborate, just family and a few key employees. I wanted to share this moment with the people who mattered most, to remind them why our work was important and why keeping it in the family was essential. Jessica arrived late, claiming traffic, though I suspected she'd timed her entrance to make a statement. She was wearing a white sundress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and she carried herself with the kind of languid grace that suggested the entire evening was a minor inconvenience she was enduring out of politeness. "Congratulations on your little housing project, Victoria," she said, air kissing my cheeks with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a distant relative at a funeral. "It's so nice when these urban renewal things work out." Urban renewal, little housing project. Each word was carefully chosen to diminish what we'd accomplished, but I smiled and thanked her, because that's what successful women do. We absorb the microaggressions and keep moving forward. We save our energy for battles that actually matter. The dinner conversation was strained from the beginning. David seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and offering only generic congratulations when prompted. Sarah was more engaged, but kept steering the conversation towards social justice theory, rather than celebrating our practical achievements. "I think it's important to examine whether these developments actually serve the community or just gentrify existing neighborhoods," she said while picking at her salmon. "Sometimes what looks like progress is actually just another form of colonization." Colonization. My own daughter was using academic buzzwords to describe the work that had funded her education and would secure her future. "Sarah," I said, setting down my fork more firmly than necessary, "this project will provide 200 units of affordable housing in a neighborhood where the average wait time for public housing is 18 months. It will create 400 construction jobs for local workers and 150 permanent retail positions. How exactly is that colonization? I'm just saying we need to be mindful of what? Of helping people? Of creating opportunities? Of doing exactly what you claim to want, but through actual work instead of academic theories?" The table fell silent. This was the kind of confrontation our family usually avoided, the kind of direct challenge that made everyone uncomfortable. But I was tired of tiptoeing around my children's consciences while they criticized the very foundation of their privilege. Jessica, however, saw an opportunity. "Victoria," she said, her voice taking on the tone of a kindergarten teacher addressing a difficult child, "I think Sarah is just trying to express some valid concerns about community impact. Maybe we could all benefit from listening to different perspectives instead of getting defensive." Defensive, as if responding to criticism of my life's work was an emotional overreaction rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable attack. "Jessica," I said, my voice carefully controlled, "with all due respect, You've never lived in an underserved community, never worked in community development, and never put your own money at risk to help people who remind you of your own family. Maybe you should listen to some different perspectives yourself. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I saw David shift uncomfortably in his seat, Sarah's eyes widen, and Jessica's smile falter for just a moment before reassembling itself into something sharper. "Well," she said, reaching for her wine glass, "I suppose we all have our own ways of contributing to society. Some of us prefer to do it without making such a public spectacle of ourselves." Public spectacle. As if success was something to be ashamed of. As if building wealth and using it to lift others was somehow vulgar compared to inheriting wealth and using it to maintain status quo. But I let it slide, because that's what you do when you're trying to preserve family peace. You absorb the insults and hope that love will eventually overcome resentment. I was wrong about that too. Chapter 6, The Final Dinner, which brings us back to tonight. Back to the chandelier witnessing something it had never seen before. Back to words that cut deeper than any blade, and moments that change everything. I had invited everyone for what I thought would be a simple family dinner. No agenda, no business discussion, no celebration or crisis to navigate. Just a chance to sit around the table that had hosted 40 years of family meals and remember why we were connected to each other beyond blood and money. David and Jessica were 30 minutes late, arriving with the kind of apologetic bustle that suggested they'd had an argument in the car. Sarah was already there, having spent the afternoon helping me prepare dinner, a rare gesture that had filled me with hope that maybe we were finding our way back to each other. The conversation started pleasantly enough. We talked about Sarah's work at the nonprofit, about David's new interest in sailing, apparently a skill required for membership at Countryside Club, about the unseasonably warm weather and the cherry blossoms blooming early around the tidal basin. But I could sense tension building beneath the surface. David seemed agitated, fidgeting with his napkin and avoiding eye contact. Jessica was performing her usual role as the gracious guest, but there was something sharper in her smile tonight, something more predatory in the way she watched me. The trouble started when Sarah mentioned a news article about a new affordable housing initiative in D.C. "It's exactly the kind of work you and Dad used to do," she said, and for the first time in months, her voice carried genuine admiration instead of criticism. "Maybe Sterling Enterprises should bid on some of these projects. Get back to your roots." Get back to your roots, as if we'd ever left them. As if the Baltimore project we'd just completed wasn't exactly that kind of work. But I chose to interpret her comment charitably, as a sign that maybe she was beginning to understand and appreciate what we'd built. "We never stopped doing that kind of work, sweetheart," I said. "The Baltimore project is exactly what you're describing. Maybe you should come visit the site sometime, see what we're building." "Maybe I will," Sarah said, and she seemed to mean it. I think I've been too quick to judge without understanding. It was a moment of connection, the kind that had become increasingly rare in our family. I felt something loosening in my chest, a hope that maybe we could find our way back to each other after all. That's when Jessica decided to poison the well. "Oh, Sarah, that's so sweet of you to take an interest in your mother's work," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could make a compliment feel like an insult. Though I have to say, I sometimes wonder if all this emphasis on urban development is really the best use of Sterling Enterprises' resources. The pause before urban development was deliberate, loaded with the kind of coded language that everyone at the table understood but no one wanted to acknowledge. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though from her tone, I could tell she knew exactly what Jessica meant. "I just think there might be more prestigious opportunities in commercial development, office buildings, luxury retail, that sort of thing. Projects that attract the right kind of investors and clients. The right kind." There it was again, that carefully coded language that said everything while claiming to say nothing at all. "The Baltimore project is commercial development," I said, Mixed use, retail, community health center. It's exactly the kind of comprehensive development that attracts serious investors. Oh, I'm sure it is, Jessica replied, though her tone suggested she was humoring me. I just think David has such wonderful ideas for expanding into different markets, more upscale markets, places where Sterling Enterprises could really make its mark. Make its mark. As if 40 years of successful development in communities across the mid-Atlantic wasn't already making our mark. As if projects that changed lives and built wealth simultaneously weren't impressive enough for her standards. Jessica, I said, setting down my fork. Sterling Enterprises has been making its mark for 4 decades. We've built schools, hospitals, affordable housing, and commercial developments that have revitalized entire neighborhoods. What exactly are you suggesting we haven't accomplished? Nothing. God, nothing at all. I just think, well, David has such vision for taking things to the next level. Don't you, darling? She turned to David, who had been sitting in increasingly uncomfortable silence throughout this exchange. I watched my son's face, waiting for him to defend our family's work, to acknowledge what we'd built together, to remember who he was and where he came from. Instead, he cleared his throat and looked at his hands. Jessica and I have been talking, he said, and we think maybe it's time for Sterling Enterprises to evolve, to move into more mainstream markets. Mainstream. Another coded word. Mainstream meant white. Mainstream meant abandoning the communities that had made our success possible in favor of chasing approval from people who would never fully accept us anyway. David, I said, my voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in my chest, Sterling Enterprises is already mainstream. We're a billion-dollar company. We work with major investors, international banks, and Fortune 500 companies. What exactly isn't mainstream about that? I think what David means, Jessica interjected, is that there are certain perceptions about Sterling Enterprises' focus that might limit growth opportunities. Image matters in business, and sometimes you have to consider how your brand is perceived in different markets. Perceptions, image, brand, all euphemisms. For the same thing, we were too black for her comfort, too focused on our community for her standards, too rooted in our values for her vision of respectability. And what perception would that be? Sarah asked, her voice sharp with the kind of anger I hadn't heard from her since she was a teenager fighting about curfew. Jessica's smile flickered, but she pressed on. I just think some people might see Sterling Enterprises as niche, focused on a particular demographic rather than serving broader markets. A particular demographic. She couldn't bring herself to say black communities or underserved neighborhoods, but she could suggest that serving them was somehow limiting rather than meaningful. Jessica, I said, and my voice was so quiet that everyone at the table leaned forward slightly. That particular demographic you're referring to? Those are the communities that built this company. Those are the people who trusted us with their dreams and their savings when no one else would. Those are the neighborhoods where David and Sarah grew up volunteering, where they learned the value of service and community investment. I understand that, she replied, but times change. Markets evolve. Sometimes you have to choose between sentimentality and success. Sentimentality. 40 years of community investment, of building wealth while building up neighborhoods, of proving that profitable development and social responsibility weren't mutually exclusive, all of that was just sentimentality in her mind. What kind of success are you talking about? Sarah demanded. Because Sterling Enterprises is already successful, incredibly successful. Of course it is, Jessica said, but there's successful and then there's the kind of success that opens certain doors, the kind that gets you invited to the right tables, introduced to the right people, included in the right conversations. The right tables, the right people, the right conversations, all code for white spaces, white money, white approval. David, I said, turning to my son, do you agree with this assessment? Do you think the work we've done, the communities we've served, the legacy your father and I built, do you think all of that was just sentimentality holding us back from real success? David squirmed in his chair, caught between his wife's expectations and his mother's direct question. I think Jessica raises some valid points about market positioning and brand development. Market positioning, brand development. He was parroting business school buzzwords to avoid taking a stand on the values that had shaped his entire life. What I think, Jessica said, apparently sensing that David was wavering, is that this family has accomplished wonderful things, but it's time to think bigger, to move beyond community focus and into real wealth building. Real wealth building, as if the billion-dollar company we'd built wasn't real enough for her standards. Beyond community focus, I repeated. You mean beyond caring about people who look like us? I mean beyond limiting yourselves to niche markets when you could be competing in the big leagues. Jessica, Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet, what do you think the big leagues are? Because from where I'm sitting, Sterling Enterprises is already playing in the big leagues, unless you're defining the big leagues as places where Black people aren't welcome. That's not what I meant at all, Jessica protested, but her voice had taken on a defensive edge that suggested Sarah had hit the target. I'm talking about maximizing potential, about not letting cultural attachments limit business growth. Cultural attachments, our connection to our community, our commitment to lifting others as we climbed, our refusal to abandon our values for the sake of broader acceptance, all of that was just cultural attachment holding us back from greatness. You know what I think? I said, standing up from my chair. I think you're asking us to choose between being successful and being Black, and I think you believe we can't be both. That's not true, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I challenged, because everything Jessica is describing, mainstream markets, broader appeal, moving beyond community focus, all of it sounds like code for distancing ourselves from anything that identifies us with Black communities. You're being dramatic, Mom. Am I? Then tell me, David, what exactly is Jessica asking you to do differently? What markets are we not serving? What opportunities are we missing? What success are we not achieving? David opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. He had no answer because there was no answer. Sterling Enterprises was already successful by any reasonable measure. We were already competing at the highest levels, serving diverse markets, working with major investors and clients. The only thing we weren't doing was abandoning our commitment to community development and social responsibility. The only thing we weren't doing was pretending we weren't proud of our heritage and our values. Sometimes, Jessica said when it became clear that David couldn't articulate a response, success requires sacrifice. It requires making hard choices about what matters most, maintaining comfort zones or reaching for something greater. Comfort zones. She was describing our commitment to our community, our connection to our roots, our refusal to abandon our values as comfort zones that needed to be sacrificed for greater success. And what would that something greater look like? I asked. It would look like David running a company that competes with the biggest development firms in the country. It would look like Sterling Enterprises being mentioned in the same breath as the Trumps, the Kushners, the major players in commercial real estate. The Trumps, the Kushners. She wanted us to aspire to be like families that had built their fortunes on discrimination, exploitation, and political corruption. She wanted us to model ourselves after people who had succeeded by stepping on the communities we had committed to lifting up. You want us to be like the Trumps, Sarah said, incredulous. I want David to be recognized for the brilliant businessman he is, Jessica replied. I want him to get the respect he deserves, the opportunities he's earned, the success that's his birthright. His birthright. Not something he had to work for, not something he had to prove he deserved, but something that belonged to him simply because he was born into our family. "Jessica," I said, my voice still quiet but carrying a warning that everyone at the table could hear. David's birthright isn't just wealth, it's values, it's responsibility, it's the understanding that with great privilege comes great obligation to those who don't have the same advantages. "That's a lovely philosophy," she replied, "but philosophy doesn't build dynasties. The Kennedys didn't build their legacy by limiting themselves to Irish communities. The Rockefellers didn't restrict themselves to Baptist charities. Great families think beyond their origins. Beyond their origins." She wanted us to abandon everything that made us who we were in pursuit of acceptance from people who would never fully accept us anyway. "The Kennedys and Rockefellers," I said, "built their fortunes through politics and oil, respectively. They didn't abandon their communities. They used their power to influence national policy and economic systems. They didn't distance themselves from their values. They imposed their values on entire industries." "Exactly my point," Jessica exclaimed. "They thought bigger than community development and urban renewal. They played on a national stage, influenced national policy, built national legacies. By exploiting national resources and manipulating national systems," Sarah added, "by using their wealth to concentrate power rather than distribute it. By winning," Jessica shot back, "by being remembered, by building something that lasted beyond one generation and one geographic area. Sterling Enterprises has lasted beyond one generation," I said. "It's operating in 12 states. It employs over 3,000 people. It's influenced housing policy at the federal level and community development practices across the country." "What exactly are you saying we haven't accomplished?" "I'm saying David could accomplish so much more if he wasn't constrained by legacy expectations." Legacy expectations. She meant me. She meant the values Marcus and I had instilled in our children. She meant the commitment to community that had guided every decision we'd made for 40 years. "Mom," David said, finally finding his voice, "maybe we should consider some of these ideas. Maybe it's time to think about expanding our focus, broadening our market appeal." "Broadening our market appeal to whom?" I demanded. "We already work with clients across every demographic. We already serve markets from luxury condos to affordable housing. We already have relationships with investors, banks, and government agencies at every level. Who exactly are we not appealing to?" David looked at Jessica, then back at me, then down at his hands again. Maybe people who see community focus as limiting rather than expansive. People who see community focus as limiting. People who think caring about Black communities is a business disadvantage. People who would respect us more if we abandoned our values and chased their approval instead. "And those are the people whose opinions matter to you?" I asked. "Those are the people who control the biggest opportunities," Jessica answered for him. "Those are the people who decide who gets invited to bid on the major projects, who gets included in the exclusive deals, who gets access to the real money." The real money. As if the $1 billion we'd already made wasn't real. As if the communities we'd transformed, the lives we'd changed, the legacy we'd built wasn't substantial enough for her definition of success. "Jessica," I said, and my voice was getting quieter as my anger was getting larger. "Let me ask you something. Do you think I've been successful? Of course. You've built an amazing company. Do you think I'm a strong businesswoman? Absolutely. You're incredibly impressive. Do you think I'm a good mother? Well, yes, of course. You've given your children every advantage. Then why do you think your mother-in-law, a successful businesswoman who built $1 billion company from nothing, who raised 2 college-educated children, who has employed thousands of people and transformed dozens of communities, why do you think she needs advice from someone who has never built anything, never employed anyone, never risked her own money on her own vision?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jessica's smile faltered completely for the first time all evening. David shifted uncomfortably. Sarah sat back in her chair with something that might have been satisfaction. "I never said you needed advice," Jessica replied, but her voice had lost its honeyed confidence. "I was just suggesting that different perspectives might be valuable." Different perspectives from whom? From someone who inherited her wealth instead of building it? From someone whose family's money came from owning people who looked like me? From someone who thinks success means abandoning the communities that made that success possible? "That's not fair," David protested. Jessica's family what?" I interrupted. "Has a different history? Made their money differently? Comes from a different tradition of wealth and power?" "They're good people," David said weakly. "I'm sure they are. But good people can still have blind spots. Good people can still carry unconscious biases. Good people can still believe that their way of being successful is the only legitimate way." Jessica's face had gone pale, but her eyes were bright with anger. "I think you're making this about race when it's really about business strategy." "Everything is about race when you're black in America," Sarah said quietly, "especially business strategy." "That's exactly the kind of thinking that limits growth," Jessica snapped, her southern accent becoming more pronounced as her composure slipped. "That's exactly the kind of victim mentality that keeps people from reaching their full potential." Victim mentality. There it was, the phrase that racists used when they wanted to dismiss the reality of systemic inequality without having to examine their own role in perpetuating it. "Jessica," I said, my voice still dangerously quiet, "let me tell you what victim mentality actually looks like. Victim mentality is thinking that a billion-dollar company isn't successful enough because it serves black communities. Victim mentality is believing that you can't be truly wealthy unless white people approve of how you made your money. Victim mentality is abandoning your values and your people because you're afraid someone might not invite you to their country club. That's not what Victim mentality," I continued, "is marrying into a family and then spending 2 years trying to convince them that everything they've accomplished isn't good enough, isn't respectable enough, isn't white enough to matter." "Mom!" David stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "That's enough. Jessica was just trying to help." "Help with what, David? Help us become more acceptable to people who will never truly accept us? Help us abandon the communities that supported us when no one else would? Help us forget who we are and where we came from? Help us grow," he shouted, and the desperation in his voice broke something in my heart. "Help us become more than just what? Just a black business serving black communities." The words exploded out of him like they'd been trapped under pressure for months. And there it was, the real truth underneath all the coded language and business school buzzwords. My son was ashamed of who we were. He was ashamed of the communities we served. He was ashamed of the legacy his father and I had built. "There it is," Sarah said, her voice filled with disgust. "There's what Jessica has been teaching you. That being a successful black business is somehow less legitimate than being a successful business that happens to be black-owned." "That's not what I meant," David said, but he couldn't look at any of us. "That's exactly what you meant," I said, "and it's exactly what Jessica has been saying all evening, just in more polite language." "I think everyone needs to calm down," Jessica said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "This is getting way too emotional." "Emotional?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My brother just said he's ashamed of our family's business because it serves black communities. And you think we're being too emotional?" "I didn't say I was ashamed," David protested. "Then what did you say?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounded like you think Sterling Enterprises is just a black business serving black communities, and that's somehow limiting rather than meaningful. I think we could be more." "More than what? More than $1 billion company?" More than an employer of 3,000 people? More than a transformer of communities? More than a builder of generational wealth? What exactly is more than that, David? More universal. More broadly appealing. More white? Sarah finished. More successful, he shouted. By whose definition? I demanded. Because by every objective measure, revenue, profit, employee satisfaction, community impact, industry recognition, Sterling Enterprises is already incredibly successful. So whose definition of success are you using? David looked at Jessica, and I saw the answer in his eyes. He was using her definition of success, her family's definition, her community's definition. The definition that said serving Black communities was charity work rather than business strategy. That building wealth while building up neighborhoods was sentimentality rather than smart investing. That being proud of your heritage was limiting rather than empowering. I think what David is trying to say, Jessica said, her voice carefully controlled again, is that there are opportunities for growth that might require strategic repositioning. Strategic repositioning. More euphemisms for abandoning our values. And what would that strategic repositioning look like? I asked. Well, for starters, maybe focusing less on affordable housing and more on luxury development. Maybe partnering with different kinds of community organizations. Maybe marketing to different demographics. You mean whiter demographics? I mean broader demographics. Jessica, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked my garden, do you know why Marcus and I started this company? To build wealth? I turned back to face her. We started this company because in 1985, I watched a family get evicted from their apartment because the landlord wanted to convert the building to condos. The father worked 2 jobs, the mother worked nights cleaning office buildings, and they had 3 kids under the age of 10. They weren't behind on rent. They weren't causing problems. They were just poor and Black, and their poverty and Blackness made them inconvenient when the neighborhood started gentrifying. That's very sad, but I don't see what... I watched those 3 children cry as their furniture was put on the sidewalk. I watched their parents try to explain why they had to leave the only home those kids had ever known. And I made a decision that day that I would never just watch that happen again. Victoria, that's a beautiful story, but I decided that I would build a company that created housing instead of destroying it. That developed communities instead of displacing them. That built wealth by lifting people up instead of pushing them out. And you did that. You should be proud. I am proud. I'm proud that Sterling Enterprises has built over 5,000 units of affordable housing. I'm proud that we've created over 15,000 jobs in communities that other developers ignored. I'm proud that we've trained hundreds of minority contractors and helped dozens of small businesses get their start. Then why are you so resistant to growth? Because what you're calling growth, I'm calling abandonment. You're asking us to abandon our mission so we can chase the approval of people who fundamentally disagree with that mission. I'm asking you to think bigger than one mission. Why? The question came out louder than I intended. Why should we think beyond a mission that's working? Why should we abandon values that have made us successful? Why should we change strategies that have built generational wealth while transforming communities? Because you could build even more wealth. You could have even more impact. More impact on whom? Because the communities we're serving now need that impact. The families who live in our developments, work in our buildings, send their kids to the schools we've helped fund. They need what we're doing. Are you saying their needs don't matter as much as the potential profits we could make in other markets? Jessica's mouth opened and closed like she was searching for an answer that wouldn't sound callous. You are saying that, Sarah said, her voice full of realization. You're saying that serving Black communities is less important than making money in white markets. I'm saying that business is business, Jessica replied. And if you want to maximize your business potential, you can't let emotional attachments guide your strategy. Emotional attachments. There it was again, the dismissal of our values as sentiment rather than principle. Jessica, I said, returning to my seat, let me ask you something else. Do you love David? Of course I do. Why? What do you mean, why? I mean, what do you love about him? What attracted you to him? What makes him special in your eyes? She looked confused, like it was a trick question. He's intelligent, ambitious, hardworking, successful. Anything else? He's kind, generous, thoughtful. And where do you think those qualities came from? Where did he learn to be hardworking and ambitious? Where did he develop his sense of generosity and social responsibility? From his family, I suppose. From this family, from the values Marcus and I taught him, from growing up in a household that believed success meant lifting others as you climb, from watching his parents build wealth by serving communities that other people ignored or exploited. I understand that. Do you? Because you're asking him to abandon the very values that made him the man you fell in love with. You're asking him to become someone who sees community service as a limitation rather than a calling. Someone who measures success by white approval rather than black empowerment. Someone who would rather be accepted by strangers than be respected by his own family. That's not what I'm asking. Then what are you asking? Jessica looked at David, then back at me, then down at her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, less confident. I'm asking him to want more. More than what? More than being defined by his race, more than being limited to serving one community, more than having to prove himself over and over again to people who will never see him as their equal anyway. And there it was. The real truth underneath all the business strategy talk and market positioning theory. Jessica didn't want David to abandon our values because she thought it would make him more successful. She wanted him to abandon our values because she was tired of being married to a black man who was proud of being black. Jessica, I said, my voice very quiet now, you just said that David is limited by serving communities that will never see him as their equal. But the communities we serve do see him as their equal. They see him as their advocate, their partner. They're proof that success doesn't require abandoning your people. But what about communities that do have power? What about markets that control real wealth? What about people who could open doors that your traditional communities can't open? Traditional communities, another euphemism. What doors do you think we need opened that aren't already open? I asked. What markets do you think we're not already serving? What wealth do you think we're not already accessing? I think there are levels of success that require different kinds of relationships, different kinds of social connections, different kinds of cultural capital. Cultural capital. She meant white cultural capital. She meant country club memberships and charity galas and social connections with people who had inherited their wealth instead of building it. And you think those relationships are more valuable than the ones we already have? I think they're different. And I think David deserves access to all kinds of opportunities, not just the ones available through community connections. Community connections. She couldn't bring herself to say black connections, but that's what she meant. David, I said, turning to my son, do you agree with Jessica's assessment? Do you think the business relationships we've built over 40 years, the community connections that have sustained us through multiple economic downturns, the partnerships with banks and investors and government agencies, do you think those are somehow inferior to the relationships Jessica is describing? David looked trapped, caught between his wife's expectations and his mother's direct question. I think different relationships provide different opportunities. That's not what I asked. I asked if you think our existing relationships are inferior. No, I don't think they're inferior. I just think maybe we could expand our network. To include whom? To include people from different backgrounds. We already work with people from different backgrounds. Our clients include everyone from first-time homebuyers to Fortune 500 companies. Our investors include pension funds, insurance companies, and international banks. Our contractors and suppliers represent every demographic you can imagine. What different backgrounds are you talking about? David glanced at Jessica again, and I saw her give him an almost imperceptible nod. Maybe people who are more established, more connected to traditional power structures. More white? Sarah asked. More influential, David said, his frustration finally showing. More connected to the people who really make decisions in this country. And you think black people don't really make decisions in this country? I think there are decisions that get made in rooms where people who look like us aren't invited. So your solution is to try to get invited to those rooms by becoming the kind of black person they're comfortable with? My solution is to get invited to those rooms so I can change what happens in them. By abandoning the communities that need you to be in those rooms on their behalf? By building enough power to help those communities from a position of strength, instead of always asking for scraps. Asking for scraps. He thought that building wealth while building up communities, that creating opportunities for people who looked like us, that proving black businesses could be profitable and principled simultaneously, he thought all of that was asking for scraps. David, I said, and my voice was very tired now. Sterling Enterprises is already operating from a position of strength. We already have power. We already influence policy, shape markets, and create opportunities for thousands of people. What more power are you talking about? The power to be invited instead of having to fight for every opportunity. The power to be included instead of having to prove ourselves over and over again. The power to be respected automatically instead of having to earn respect through perfect performance. And you think white people will give you that power if you distance yourself from black communities? I think they'll give me access to that power if I prove I can think beyond black communities. Beyond black communities. Beyond the people who had supported us, invested in us, trusted us with their dreams and their savings. Beyond the neighborhoods where we'd learned the value of hard work and community investment. Beyond the values that had shaped every decision we'd made for 40 years. And what happens to black communities when successful black people think beyond them? Other people will serve them. Other businesses will meet those needs. What other businesses? What other people? David didn't have an answer because there was no good answer. The truth was that if everyone with the resources to make a difference decided to think beyond the communities that needed that difference most, those communities would be left with nothing but thoughts and prayers from people who had never lived their struggles. You know what I think? Jessica said, apparently deciding that David needed her rescue again. I think this conversation has gotten way off track. All I ever suggested was that Sterling Enterprises could benefit from expanding its market focus. I never said anything about abandoning communities or forgetting values or any of the dramatic things you're accusing me of. Dramatic things. She was trying to reframe the conversation, to make it seem like I was overreacting to innocent business suggestions. Jessica, I said, my patience finally wearing thin, let me tell you exactly what you've suggested tonight. You've suggested that serving black communities is niche rather than meaningful. You've suggested that our community focus is an emotional attachment that limits growth. You've suggested that we need to move into mainstream markets to achieve real success. You've suggested that we should model ourselves after families whose wealth came from exploitation and discrimination. You've dismissed 40 years of community investment as sentimentality and cultural attachment. You've implied that being proud of our heritage and committed to our values is somehow holding us back from true achievement. I never said any of those things directly. No, you didn't, because you're too polite to say what you really mean. But everyone at this table knows exactly what you mean. Everyone at this table understands the coded language you've been using all evening. I think you're reading things into my comments that weren't there. Am I? Then let me ask you directly. Do you think Sterling Enterprises would be more successful if it focused less on serving Black communities? Jessica's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I think Sterling Enterprises could be successful serving any communities it chose to serve. That's not what I asked. I think there might be more growth opportunities in other markets. More profitable opportunities? Potentially, yes. So you do think we should prioritize profit over community impact? I think you can do both. But if you had to choose, I don't think you should have to choose. But if you did. Jessica looked around the table, realizing she was trapped by her own logic. If she said community impact, she'd be contradicting everything she'd argued for all evening. If she said profit, she'd be revealing the callousness underneath her polite suggestions. I think, she said slowly, I think the most responsible thing is to maximize the company's potential so it can have the greatest possible impact. Maximize potential. Greatest possible impact. More euphemisms for choosing profit over principle. And you think our potential is maximized by serving different communities? I think your potential could be maximized by serving additional communities, wealthier communities, more diverse communities, whiter communities. I never said anything about race. You didn't have to. Everything you've described, mainstream markets, broader appeal, different demographics, traditional power structures, all of it is code for the same thing. That's not fair. You're putting words in my mouth. I'm translating the words that were already in your mouth. Mom, David said, I think you're being unfair to Jessica. She's been nothing but supportive of our family and our business. Supportive. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be strong and principled and proud of his heritage, and I wondered when he'd become so willing to accept conditional support. When had he started valuing politeness over honesty, coded language over direct communication, empty compliments over genuine respect? David, I said, let me ask you something. Do you remember the first construction site I ever took you to? Mom, I don't see what. Do you remember? He sighed. Yes, the Mitchell Street apartments. I was 8. Do you remember what you said when you saw the families moving into those apartments? I said they looked happy. You said they looked like us. You said you were proud that we were building houses for people who looked like us. Do you remember that? Yes, but that was different. I was a child. What's different about it? I didn't understand business then. I didn't understand markets and opportunities and growth strategies. You understood something more important than all of that. You understood connection. You understood responsibility. You understood that success means something different when it includes rather than excludes your community. But I still believe that, do you? Because everything you've said tonight suggests that you see serving our community as a limitation rather than an opportunity. Everything Jessica has suggested implies that being connected to Black communities holds us back from real success. That's not true. Then prove it. Tell me right now, are you proud that Sterling Enterprises serves Black communities? Are you proud that we've built our success by lifting up neighborhoods that other developers ignore? Are you proud that we've created thousands of jobs for people who look like us, trained hundreds of minority contractors, and proved that profitable development and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive? Of course I'm proud. Then why do you want to change it? Because I want to expand it. To include communities that don't need our help as much as the communities we're already serving? To include communities that could help us help more people? By distancing ourselves from the people who need our help most? By building relationships with people who have the power to create systemic change? And you think those powerful people will work with us to create change that benefits Black communities? I think they'll work with us if we prove we can think beyond just Black communities. Just Black communities. There it was again, the dismissal of our life's work as somehow narrow or limiting. David, I said, let me tell you what I think. I think you've been convinced that serving black communities is small and that serving white communities is big. I think you've been taught to see community loyalty as a weakness instead of a strength. I think you've been persuaded that the path to real power runs through white approval rather than black empowerment. That's not true. Then explain to me why every suggestion you and Jessica have made tonight involves moving away from black communities instead of deepening our commitment to them. Explain to me why growth, in your mind, means serving different people instead of serving the same people better. David looked at Jessica, then back at me, then down at his hands again. Maybe because the people we're serving now don't have the resources to support the kind of growth we could achieve. What kind of growth? National expansion, international opportunities, projects that could employ tens of thousands of people instead of hundreds. And you think black communities don't deserve that kind of investment? I think black communities can't fund that kind of investment. There it was. The real reason underneath all the business strategy talk and market positioning theory. David didn't think black communities were worth the kind of massive investment that could transform entire regions. He thought our people were too poor, too small, too limited to deserve the full scope of our ambition. David, I said, my voice very quiet now, do you know how Sterling Enterprises got its first $1 million loan? From First National Bank. Do you know why First National Bank gave us that loan when 3 other banks had turned us down? Because you had a solid business plan? Because the president of First National Bank was a man named Robert Chen, whose family had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 12 years old. He understood what it meant to build something from nothing, to be overlooked by people who should have supported you, to succeed despite systemic barriers rather than because of inherited advantages. What's your point? My point is that the communities you think are too poor to support big dreams are full of Robert Chens. People who understand struggle, who value hard work, who appreciate businesses that give back rather than just take. People who will invest in companies that represent their values, even if those investments don't offer the highest returns. But that's exactly what I'm talking about. We shouldn't have to settle for investors who value our mission over our profits. We should be attractive to investors who value our profits, period. Settle for investors who value our mission. He thought that having investors who cared about our impact was somehow inferior to having investors who only cared about our returns. And what happens when those profit-focused investors want us to cut costs by reducing community programs? What happens when they want us to maximize returns by gentrifying neighborhoods instead of developing them responsibly? What happens when their profit expectations conflict with our community commitments? We negotiate. We find compromises. We structure deals that work for everyone. We compromise our values to satisfy their expectations. We balance our values with business realities. David, Sarah said, speaking for the first time in several minutes, what you're describing isn't balance. It's capitulation. You're talking about giving up the things that make Sterling Enterprises different so we can be like every other development company that prioritizes profits over people. I'm talking about growing big enough to have more impact. Impact on whom? Because the communities we serve now are seeing plenty of impact from the work we're already doing. Impact on policy, impact on systems, impact on the kind of structural change that could help millions of people instead of thousands. And you think we can create that structural change by partnering with people who benefit from existing structures? I think we can create that change by getting powerful people to see us as partners instead of problems. Partners instead of problems. He thought that successful black people were seen as problems by white power structures, and his solution was to make ourselves so unthreatening, so similar to existing power brokers, that we'd be welcomed as partners instead. David, I said, let me tell you a story. When I was 25, I wanted to buy a building in Adams Morgan. It was a beautiful old brownstone that had been neglected for years, and I saw the potential to convert it into affordable condos for young professionals. The owner was an elderly white man who'd inherited the property from his father. "Mom, I don't see what this has to do with—" When I made my offer, which was higher than the asking price, by the way, he looked me up and down and said, "Sweetheart, I don't think this neighborhood is right for your kind of development." When I asked what he meant, he said he was looking for buyers who understood the character of the community. That's terrible, but I could have walked away. I could have found a different building in a different neighborhood where people would be more comfortable with my kind of development. Instead, I did my research. I found out that the man's father had bought that brownstone in 1923 for $800 from a black family who'd been forced to sell during the Red Summer riots. I found out that the building had been profitable rental property for 60 years before being abandoned when white flight made the neighborhood less desirable. What did you do? I brought that research to our second meeting, along with letters of support from 15 families in the neighborhood who wanted to see the building restored rather than demolished. I brought architectural drawings showing how the development would preserve the historical character while creating homeownership opportunities for people who'd been priced out of other neighborhoods. I brought financial projections showing how the project would increase property values for the entire block. Did he sell to you? He did, not because I made myself unthreatening or acceptable to his prejudices, but because I forced him to confront the fact that his prejudices were preventing him from making a smart business decision. I didn't become his partner by abandoning my values. I became his partner by proving that my values produced better results than his assumptions. That's a great story, Mom, but things are different now. Are they? Because everything you and Jessica have suggested tonight sounds like you want to make Sterling Enterprises more acceptable to people's prejudices instead of challenging those prejudices with excellent work. We want to make Sterling Enterprises more successful. By whose definition of success? The question hung in the air again, and again David had no answer that didn't reveal the fundamental problem with his thinking. "I think," Jessica said, clearly sensing that the conversation was slipping away from her, "that we're talking about two different approaches to the same goal. Victoria, you've built something incredible by staying focused on community development, but David and I are talking about scaling that success to have even greater impact by serving different communities, by serving more communities, wealthier communities, underserved communities of all kinds. Name one." What? Name one underserved community that we're not already working in. Name one group of people who need affordable housing, commercial development, or community investment that Sterling Enterprises isn't already serving. Jessica opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "I'm sure there are rural communities that could benefit from development. We've built affordable housing in rural Virginia, rural Maryland, and rural North Carolina. We've developed commercial projects in small towns across Appalachia. What other rural communities are you talking about? Maybe immigrant communities that are underserved? 40% of our tenants are first or second generation immigrants. We've partnered with refugee resettlement agencies, immigrant business associations, and multilingual community organizations. We employ translators, cultural liaisons, and immigration attorneys. What immigrant communities are we not serving?" Jessica looked increasingly uncomfortable as it became clear that she had no knowledge of the actual scope of Sterling Enterprises' work. She'd spent 2 years criticizing our business model without understanding what that model actually included. "I think the point," David said, jumping in to rescue his wife, "is that there might be other approaches to community development that could be more scalable." More scalable how? Through partnerships with larger firms, through access to bigger pools of capital, Through relationships with institutions that have national reach. We already have partnerships with larger firms when projects require their expertise. We already access large pools of capital through pension funds, insurance companies, and international investors. We already work with institutions that have national reach, including federal agencies, national banks, and multinational corporations. What are you actually suggesting that we're not already doing? I'm suggesting that we could be the lead partner instead of the junior partner. I'm suggesting that we could be setting the agenda instead of responding to other people's agendas. David, I said, standing up and walking back to the window, Sterling Enterprises is the lead partner on 70% of our projects. We set the development agenda for 3 major metropolitan areas. We influence housing policy at the state and federal level. We're not the junior partner in anything we do. But we could be more. More than what? More than a regional player. More than a niche developer. More than a black business that happens to be successful. A black business that happens to be successful. There it was. The phrase that revealed everything. David didn't see Sterling Enterprises as a successful business that happened to be black-owned. He saw us as a black business, with all the limitations he associated with that identity, that had managed to achieve some success despite those limitations. You think being a black business is something we need to overcome instead of something we should be proud of. I think being successful should be more important than being black. The words exploded out of him like a gunshot, and the silence that followed was deafening. Sarah gasped. Jessica looked stricken. Even David seemed shocked by what he'd said. David, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, did you just say that being successful is more important than being black? That's not what I meant. What did you mean? I meant that business success shouldn't be limited by racial identity. And you think our racial identity has limited our business success? I think it might have. $1 billion company with operations in 12 states and 3,000 employees, and you think our racial identity has limited our success? I think we might have been even more successful if we hadn't been so focused on racial identity, even more successful. He looked around our dining room, at the original artwork, the handcrafted furniture, the crystal chandelier, the view of the garden that Marcus had designed, and he thought we could have been even more successful if we'd been less black. David, Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger, do you hear yourself right now? Do you understand what you just said to our mother? I said that business success shouldn't be constrained by... You said that Mom and Dad would have been more successful if they'd been less proud of being black. That's not what I said. That's exactly what you said. You said our focus on racial identity has limited our success. Our racial identity, David, not our business strategy, not our market focus, not our community partnerships. Our identity as black people. I'm talking about business positioning. You're talking about being ashamed of who you are. I'm not ashamed. Then why do you think being black has held us back? Because there are opportunities that might not be available to companies that are seen as primarily serving black communities. And why is that our problem instead of their problem? What do you mean? I mean, if there are people who won't work with us because we serve black communities, why is the solution for us to serve fewer black communities instead of for them to examine their prejudices? David stared at his sister like she'd asked him to solve quantum physics. Because, Jessica said, apparently deciding David needed rescue again, you can't control other people's prejudices, but you can control your own business strategies. So we should accommodate their prejudices? You should work around their limitations by abandoning the communities that need us most, by expanding beyond communities that limit your growth potential. There it was again, communities that limit growth potential. She thought serving black communities was inherently limiting rather than inherently valuable. Jessica, I said, turning back toward the table, let me ask you one more question. Of course. Do you think I'm successful? Yes, absolutely. Do you think I'm a strong woman? Of course. Do you think I'm intelligent, capable, and accomplished? Victoria, yes, obviously. Then let me tell you something, Jessica. Everything you see in me, my strength, my intelligence, my capability, my success, comes from the same source as my commitment to Black communities. You can't separate my achievements from my identity. You can't take the parts of me you admire and discard the parts that make you uncomfortable. I walked back to my chair and placed my hands on the back of it, looking directly at her. I am successful because I'm Black, not in spite of it. I am strong because I learned to navigate a world that didn't want me to succeed. I am intelligent because I had to be twice as smart to get half as far. I am capable because I had to build everything from scratch with no safety net and no second chances. Jessica's face had gone completely pale. The woman you think your mother is, the woman you think I'm not even half of, built her strength by standing on the foundation that other people laid for her. She inherited her opportunities, her connections, her social capital, her very sense of what success looks like. She never had to prove she belonged because people who looked like her built the rooms she was invited into. I leaned forward slightly, but I built my own room, from the ground up, with my own hands and my own vision and my own values, and then I invited other people who looked like me to join me in that room. That's not limitation, Jessica. That's legacy. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. David wouldn't meet my eyes. Sarah was staring at Jessica with something between pity and disgust. You're not even half the woman my mother is, Jessica said suddenly, her voice shaking with anger and humiliation. I pushed my chair back and stood slowly, smoothing down my dress. You're absolutely right, I said calmly. I'm not even half the woman your mother is. Jessica looked surprised, as if she'd expected me to argue. Your mother never had to build a billion-dollar company from nothing. Your mother never had to prove herself in rooms where she was the only person who looked like her. Your mother never had to choose between her values and her success because she never lived in a world where those things were in conflict. I walked toward the door, then turned back. Your mother never had to be a whole woman, Jessica. She only had to be half of one, the acceptable half, the unthreatening half, the half that fit into spaces other people built for her. But I had to be whole. I had to be all of myself all the time because anything less would have been failure. I looked at David, my son. This man I'd raised to be proud and strong and uncompromising in his values. When you're ready to be whole again, I said to him, you know where to find me, but I won't watch you become half a man to make other people comfortable. I walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, and up the stairs to my bedroom. Behind me, I could hear Jessica crying, David trying to comfort her, and Sarah's voice sharp with disappointment, telling them both exactly what she thought of their performance. From my bedroom window, I could see the lights of the city I'd helped reshape, the communities I'd helped strengthen, the legacy I'd built with my own hands and my own vision. Tomorrow, Sterling Enterprises would continue its work. Tomorrow, we would break ground on another project that proved profitable development and social responsibility weren't mutually exclusive. Tomorrow, I would be whole, whether my son chose to join me or not.